Richard Thomas was just a teenager when the Waltons began. But even back then, before the fame, the awards, the reunion specials, he noticed something. Something between Michael Learnid and Ralph Waite that no one talked about. They weren't just co-stars. They weren't just playing husband and wife. There was a closeness, a tension, a tenderness that felt real. Too real. For decades, fans asked, were they in love? Was it just acting? Why didn't they ever get together? Really get together? Richard never answered. He kept quiet. Until now, they were America's favorite couple. Olivia and John Walton, the gentle, wise-hearted matriarch and the hardworking, deeply moral patriarch of a Depression-era Virginia family. And for 9 seasons, Michael Learnid and Ralph Waite made their love story feel so believable. It began to blur the line between fiction and real life. Even their castmates weren't sure where the characters ended and the people began. And Richard Thomas, who played John Boy Walton, had a front-row seat to all of it. In those early days of filming The Waltons, Richard was just 20 years old, shy, thoughtful, and eager to learn from the older actors around him. And none made more of an impression than Michael Learnid and Ralph Waite. They had a rhythm that was effortless, a trust that ran deep, and an energy between them that felt charged. They didn't flirt, not in the way young actors sometimes did on set. It was quieter than that, warmer. There were glances that lingered just a second too long, conversations that continued after the cameras stopped rolling, a comfort that felt personal. And Richard noticed. He noticed the way Ralph's eyes softened when he looked at Michael. He noticed how Michael leaned in when Ralph spoke, always listening. He noticed that when one of them was off, the other always knew, even before the director did. At the time, Richard chalked it up to chemistry, that magical, undefinable thing some actors have when they're cast together. But as the seasons passed and the bond between Michael and Ralph deepened, it became clear to those around them that this wasn't just good acting. Something else was happening, something unspoken, but neither of them ever acknowledged it. Not publicly, not privately, not even when pressed. The show became a massive success. Awards were won, ratings soared, and fans fell in love with the Waltons largely because of the quiet, emotional depth Michael Learnid and Ralph Waite brought to every scene. But behind the scenes, the truth was harder to pin down. They were both married when the show began. They were professionals. And in an era when tabloid headlines could destroy reputations, whatever was between them, if anything, was kept under strict emotional lock and key. Still, the set was buzzing with quiet speculation. The crew noticed how they always requested to rehearse alone together, how they walked to their trailers in step, how, even when they fought during a tough scene, there was an underlying affection that never cracked. And Richard Thomas? He watched it all from the sidelines. He never asked questions, never made assumptions, but the look in their eyes, the comfort in their silences, it stayed with him. Years later, after he left the show and returned for guest appearances, he said the energy between Michael and Ralph hadn't changed. If anything, it had grown more intimate, more accepting. Whatever was there had only settled deeper. He still didn't speak about it publicly, not during interviews, not at cast reunions, until recently, when a simple, offhand comment during a fan Q&A caught everyone off guard. "I always thought there was something sacred between them," he said. "They had a closeness I never saw anywhere else." No one followed up, and Richard moved on, as if he hadn't just said the one thing fans had suspected for decades. But for those paying attention, it was the first real confirmation, after all these years, that what we saw on screen wasn't entirely scripted. As the Waltons grew in popularity, so did the pressure. More cameras, more expectations, more scrutiny. And for Michael Learnid and Ralph Waite, that meant carefully guarding whatever bond they had, if only to protect the fragile trust they'd built over years of filming together. By the mid-1970s, fans were writing letters weekly asking the same question. Were they in love in real life? Was it possible their on-screen marriage had bled into reality? Michael and Ralph both gave the same polished, polite answer. They were close friends, nothing more. But those who worked on the show weren't so easily convinced. Directors spoke in hushed tones about how easy it was to film emotional scenes between them, how neither actor needed much rehearsal. They just understood each other. Lighting technicians recalled quiet moments off set when the two would sit in comfortable silence between takes. Ralph sometimes gently rubbing Michael's shoulder, or Michael resting her head on Ralph's arm, eyes closed, no word spoken. It didn't look like acting. It looked like home. And Richard Thomas, even years later, couldn't forget it. There was an ease between them, he later said. They trusted each other on a level I rarely saw in this business. But there was also restraint, so much restraint, because both Michael and Ralph were dealing with complicated personal lives outside the studio. Ralph was in the middle of a difficult divorce. Michael was navigating her own marriage and motherhood, while also carrying the emotional weight of playing Olivia Walton day in and day out. And on a show built around moral values and traditional family life, there was no room, at least not then, for open vulnerability about feelings that didn't fit the script. And so, they held back, always respectful, always professional, but always just a little too in sync. When Michael left the show temporarily in season 8, something changed. Ralph Waite, usually so grounded, seemed untethered. His performances remained strong, but his spark dimmed. Even castmates commented that he was quieter offset, more withdrawn. And when Michael returned in season 9, Ralph seemed to breathe again. It was like the sun came back out, one crew member recalled. For Richard Thomas, who had by then stepped away from the show full-time, seeing their reunion during guest appearances only confirmed what he had always sensed but never said. The bond was still there, still unspoken, still powerful. In interviews later in life, both Michael Learnid and Ralph Waite were asked, gently, about their connection. Neither ever confirmed anything beyond deep friendship, but neither denied how profound their relationship had been. And then, in 2014, Ralph Waite passed away. Michael Learnid, who had always been measured in public appearances, was visibly shaken. Her tribute was simple and quiet. "He was my spiritual husband," she said. Spiritual, not romantic, not physical, but something even deeper. The phrase stuck with fans, and with Richard Thomas, because if there was ever a word to describe what he saw between them, it was that. Spiritual, private, sacred. And now, looking back with the wisdom of age and decades of perspective, Richard has finally allowed himself to say what many always believed, that there was something real between them. Not gossip, not tabloid rumor, but a truth that lived quietly in the space between two extraordinary actors, who, for a brief time, created something on screen that was too honest, too tender, to ever be called just acting. After Ralph Waite's death, tributes poured in from all corners of the television world, but none were more anticipated or more closely watched than Michael Learnid's. And while she chose her words carefully, it was clear that something in her had shifted. The loss was personal. She didn't speak in flowery phrases. She didn't call attention to their years of playing husband and wife. Instead, she simply said, "He was my spiritual husband." For longtime fans, it was confirmation of what they had felt in their hearts for decades. And for Richard Thomas, it was a moment of deep reflection. He had remained silent for so long, not because he didn't see what was happening between Michael and Ralph, but because it never felt like his story to tell. He respected their privacy, their boundaries, their choice to keep whatever they shared away from public speculation. But as time passed and fans continued to revisit old episodes, clips, and reunion specials, the emotional power of those scenes between Olivia and John Walton only grew stronger. People weren't watching for plot anymore. They were watching for the looks, the pauses, the way Ralph's voice would catch when Olivia left the room, the way Michael's eyes would well up during a simple dinner table prayer. And suddenly, fans wanted to know, was it all written in the script? Or was something else unfolding beneath the surface? In more recent years, during Walton's fan panels and cast retrospectives, Richard has grown more open. He still protects their memory, still refuses to speculate, but he no longer hides the truth of what he witnessed. He remembers one scene in particular. It was a quiet moment, no big drama, no confrontation, just John and Olivia sitting on the front porch at dusk, talking about nothing in particular. The sun was setting, the cicadas humming, and as the cameras rolled, something happened. They weren't acting, Richard recalled. They were just being. And it was beautiful. He said no one on set said a word afterward. The director whispered, "Cut." But the crew stayed silent for several seconds longer than usual. It felt like they had just seen something real, something fragile. That moment stayed with him for years. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was gentle, sacred, a reminder that love doesn't always need to be declared or explained. Sometimes, it just is. And for Richard, that was the essence of what Michael Learnid and Ralph Waite shared. Of course, people speculated. How could they not? The chemistry was unmistakable. But part of what made it so powerful was that it was never acted on in any obvious way. There were no tabloid scandals, no affairs, just two people navigating a deep, quiet connection in a very public space. Richard has often said that what made the Waltons work wasn't the storylines or the sets. It was the relationships. And the one between Olivia and John Walton was its heart. That heart, he believes, came not from the script, but from the bond between Michael and Ralph. A bond that endured, even as their lives took different paths, even as the show ended, even as years passed and memories faded. And though Ralph is gone, Michael continues to carry that bond with quiet dignity. She doesn't speak of it often, but when she does, her voice softens. Her smile turns wistful. Richard sees it, and he honors it, not with gossip or headlines, but with gratitude, because he knows what he saw. He saw the way Ralph looked at her. He saw the way Michael leaned on him. He saw something no script could ever truly write. And now, after all these years, he's finally ready to say, yes, it was real. As the years went on and the cast of the Waltons aged, their off-screen relationships deepened in ways few expected. The fame had faded, but the bond remained, especially for those who had shared those early seasons. And for Richard Thomas, the older he got, the more he realized how rare what he'd witnessed truly was. There are plenty of shows with good chemistry, plenty of actors who become close. But what Michael Learnid and Ralph Waite shared wasn't born from rehearsals or blocking or camera angles. It was something lived in, something unspoken but unmistakable. And it lingered. Even after the Waltons ended in 1981, the cast reunited for a string of follow-up TV movies. Whenever Michael and Ralph were on screen together again, sometimes decades later, their connection still hummed underneath. Fans noticed, directors noticed, and so did Richard. What made it even more remarkable was that neither of them had an easy road after the show. Ralph Waite struggled publicly with alcoholism and personal demons. He once admitted that the Waltons had saved him, that the stability of the show, and especially his relationship with Michael, had anchored him in a way nothing else had. Michael, meanwhile, was navigating her own set of challenges, balancing motherhood, career highs and lows, and the reality of being forever associated with one iconic role. Through all of it, they remained in each other's lives. They weren't a couple. They didn't date, but they kept in touch, checking in, supporting one another, sharing an unshakable bond that few could explain. Richard has said that in all his years working in Hollywood, he's never seen anything quite like it. And that's why he finally began opening up, not to gossip or capitalize on nostalgia, but to protect something he feels fans have a right to know. He recently spoke about one of the last cast reunions they all attended. It had been years since they'd been together in one place. The set had been recreated for a special event, complete with the front porch, the rocking chairs, the soft lighting. Richard said he remembers walking onto the porch set and seeing Michael and Ralph already sitting there, just talking, quietly, like no time had passed at all. No cameras rolling, no press around, just the two of them, feet side by side, hands folded, smiles gentle. They didn't need the scene, Richard said. They were the scene. That moment was never recorded. But to Richard, it said more than any scripted line ever could. They didn't need to define their relationship, didn't need to defend it. And in many ways, their refusal to explain it only made it feel more sacred. Even now, when fans ask Richard whether Michael and Ralph were in love, he doesn't give a yes or no. What he offers instead is something more honest, something more human. I don't think they needed to label it, he said. What they had, it went beyond that. And in a world obsessed with headlines, that kind of quiet dignity feels almost revolutionary. It's no wonder fans still argue about it in comment sections decades later. Some believe they were soulmates who missed their moment. Others think it was a deep friendship, misread by those hungry for romance. But Richard's testimony, what he saw, what he felt, has added a new dimension to the conversation. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't wishful thinking. It was something real that unfolded in front of him, scene by scene, day by day. And as he looks back now, at 73, what he remembers most isn't the big moments or the scripted drama. It's the small things, the sideways glances, the laughter between takes, the warmth in Michael's eyes when Ralph walked into the room. Those memories haven't faded. If anything, they've become clearer, and Richard Thomas is finally ready to share them. As Richard Thomas reflects on his time with the Waltons, one truth becomes undeniable. What he witnessed between Michael Learnid and Ralph Waite wasn't a storyline. It wasn't a romance created for ratings. It was something far more difficult to explain. An emotional tether, invisible but unbreakable, that lasted for decades. He never saw them cross boundaries. He never saw them speak in code or steal away behind closed doors. But what he did see, what stayed with him all these years, was the quiet, patient way they held space for each other. In an industry known for egos, fast flings, and fleeting loyalties, Michael and Ralph were steady. They protected one another's dignity. They respected each other's silence. And most of all, they never exploited what they had for attention or press. That's part of why Richard has chosen, only now, to speak up. At 73, he understands how fragile those connections really are. How rare it is to witness a bond that defies definition but never fades. And fans have noticed too. Over the years, many have rewatched old scenes, looking for clues, small gestures, passing glances, the way John's hand would rest over Olivia's during tense moments. It's all there. And now, with Richard's quiet confirmation, it's as if the final piece has clicked into place. Not because he revealed a scandal, not because he exposed a secret, but because he finally said what everyone had always suspected. Yes, there was something real. Yes, it mattered. And no, it wasn't just acting. Richard once described the two of them as tuned to the same frequency. And it's that frequency that made the Walton home feel so real to millions of viewers. That rare alignment between two people who could hear each other's unspoken thoughts and trust the other to carry the emotional weight of every scene. One of the most powerful things Richard has shared came during a recent podcast appearance, where he was asked, point blank, if he thought Michael and Ralph were ever in love. He paused, smiled gently, and said, I think they loved each other very deeply, in whatever way made sense to them. That answer, more than any headline or rumor, has resonated with fans, because it doesn't assign blame or expectation. It simply acknowledges the truth of what was there, something soft, enduring, and unforgettable. And perhaps that's why so many fans still feel emotional watching reruns. It's not nostalgia alone. It's that the love felt genuine, because it was genuine. When Ralph passed in 2014, the loss was felt across generations. But for Michael Learnid, the grief was different, private, measured, but deep. Her voice cracked when speaking about him in later interviews, and her eyes still carry a kind of haunted gentleness when his name comes up. She's never told the full story, and maybe she never will. But thanks to Richard, fans now understand that they weren't imagining it. That what played out between Olivia and John wasn't just a well-written marriage. It was, in many ways, a reflection of something real, an emotional truth so pure that even decades of silence couldn't erase it. And now, at this stage of life, Richard seems to feel a responsibility, not to tell their secrets, but to preserve their legacy. To confirm that yes, love can be quiet. Yes, devotion can exist outside of convention. And yes, sometimes the most important relationships aren't the ones that make headlines. They're the ones that change lives quietly, in the background. So when Richard says, I saw it happen, he's not just talking about scenes on a soundstage. He's talking about a rare kind of connection, one that shaped him as a young actor, moved millions of fans, and still brings people to tears all these years later. Even now, after all these years, Richard Thomas speaks with reverence when remembering Michael Learnid and Ralph Waite, not because they were celebrities, not because they played iconic roles, but because they represented something deeply human, something that still touches people today. Their story was never about fame or scandal. It was about restraint, tenderness, and the quiet loyalty that only a few people in this world ever experience. They didn't need a label. They didn't need a headline, because what they shared was real, and it was enough. Richard never set out to become the keeper of their legacy, but in the end, that's exactly what he became. And now, by finally admitting what he saw all those years ago, he's allowed fans to let go of the speculation and hold on to something even more meaningful, a truth that was always there. You just had to be watching closely. For more emotional stories, check out this video.